I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. Here, I'm on Noongar land, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we are meeting on here today. So I'd like to acknowledge their ancestors past, present, and emerging. And today we have the very great pleasure of welcoming Simon Weber, who's a PhD student working working with Mark Kinder and many other colleagues in University of Tasmania. He's at the end stages, he tells me of completing his PhD, and I'll let Simon tell us more about his research now. So yeah, take it away, Simon.
Cool. Thanks, Leanne, and hello, everyone. I guess I will share my slides to get started. Just one moment while I do that. Okay, cool. I'll say as well, I'm only on one monitor at the moment, so if you want to interrupt me to ask questions, which feel free to do, you'll just have to unmute yourself and start talking because I won't be able to see you. But yeah, as Leanne said, I've been working over the last couple of years with Mark Hinder and a bunch of other people in Tasmania, and we've mostly been looking at inhibition. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the research we've been doing, or some of it. So I've given the talk the title of "On the Specificity of Stopping, Attentional and Methodological Influences on Response Inhibition." So yeah, of course, I'll define some key terms to start. So inhibitory control, broadly speaking, is just the neural suppression of motor output. Action cancellation, more specifically, is the behavioural manifestation of reactive inhibitory control. And of course, lots of different things influence the way that this manifests. So the state of the nervous system at the time when the reactive cancellation happens will influence the way it happens. So for instance, if you're driving in busy traffic and you're kind of expecting that you'll need to stop, and you've got your foot kind of over the accelerator about to press down on it, the fact that you're expecting to stop will facilitate the stopping process. And you've also got, of course, if you're stopping to changes in the environment, then you need to first attend to those changes. So all of these attentional processes are involved, and also sensory processes. You know, if you're stopping to the sound of a car horn or to like a red light or someone's brake lights or something, these things will all make a difference. And then ultimately, you've also got the mechanical suppression of motor output. But the main point here is that there are lots of different things that will influence the way that this manifests, and it's very subject to contextual differences. Why is this important to assess and understand? Well, inhibitory control declines as we age. We get worse at stopping. There's also differences in clinical populations, for instance, people with ADHD and schizophrenia. And also just from like a basic research perspective, like the neural processes that mediate stopping aren't fully understood. So that may be motivation enough to research it. I just want to confirm that people can hear me. Okay, cool. I just suddenly had that feeling of being in a room on my own. I should have had two monitors. Okay, cool. So how is this tested in the lab? So I've got here just kind of a schematic of a stop signal task. So this is kind of the gold standard, most commonly used task. This is from a consensus paper that came out in 2019, trying to reach consensus on how these should be designed. But basically on the left, you've got go trials. So this makes up the majority of the task. So someone's sitting in a computer, they see a fixation of some description, and then a stimulus appears called the go stimulus. The example they've used here is an arrow, and this means that the person needs to press a button. And this makes up the majority of the task. So someone's just sitting there, seeing things, pressing buttons. But then randomly mixed in amongst these go trials are stop trials. So this is usually like 25 to 33% of the trials. And the only difference here is that following a variable delay called a stop signal delay, a stop signal appears, and this means that the person needs to inhibit their response. So the correct response here is no response. And so, like, the main purpose of this task is to try to assess the latency of the stopping process. Of course, if someone successfully stops, then there's no behavioural response. So you can't get a direct measure of that. You need to estimate it. And the estimation of the speed of this process based on behavioural data is called the stop signal reaction time. And so you end up with one measure per participant per task, as in one piece of data. And importantly, like, calculating this, there are a number of different ways that you can calculate it, but it assumes that the go process and the stop process are distinct, and they're just kind of racing each other, and whichever one kind of reaches threshold first, it determines the behavioural outcome. And it's important that they're considered separate, because the distribution of reaction times in go trials is used to estimate the latency of stopping in stop trials. So if the stop signal is somehow influencing the go process, then this may invalidate estimates of SSRT. I just wanted to mention that because I'll touch on it again in a moment. The other thing I want to mention is that these tasks are highly heterogeneous, both before and after this consensus paper that came out in 2019. And sometimes this is because people are investigating particular things, so they've set up the experiment to look at something in particular, and it's a conscious decision. Otherwise, at other times, it's just arbitrary. So people might just decide, oh, it's easier to set up an auditory stimulus than a visual one. So yeah, point being, highly heterogeneous. And the other thing that I just want to note is that like, the primary purpose of the task is to assess the latency of stopping in the real world. And I just think it's important to question, like, is there a certain point where we're actually just learning about behavior in these tasks and not really generalizing it beyond that? Just to speak briefly about, like, the broad relevance of understanding this task, this is from that same consensus paper. So up the top here, you've got a bunch of different research domains. And this is, at the time, the number of studies that they found from a review of the literature that used stop signal tasks. So you can see, I just wanted to highlight the breadth here. So you've got clinical neurology, clinical psychology, substance abuse. Yeah, it's broadly used, and the use of it has been increasing. You can see down the bottom here. This is probably also just to do with, like, the proliferation of literature more broadly, but yeah. So SSRT has fallen into question a lot recently because of mostly violations to that assumption that I was talking about of the independence of the go and stop process. So this is an actual title from a journal article that I've humorously put on a newspaper. But yeah, I just liked the melodrama of it. But yeah, the main point I just wanted to make is that we didn't want to rely entirely on this behavioural measure. And so we've used another one as well. That on the right isn't an actual title from an article. That was just a moment of self-expression. But yeah, we used EMG as well to assess the latency of stopping. So this is the setup that we had. So you can see this kind of montage targeting the first dorsal interosseous. So normally if you hit a button, it'll be like a downwards motion if you're, like, pressing the keys on your keyboard, but the muscles that directly control that are a bit harder to target with surface EMG. So we had this sideways button here, and then we had, polystyrene and chopped up folder and chopped up swag mattress. So that was nice and cheap to set up, but it worked. It still does work. But how does this help you assess the latency of stopping? Well, on a number of trials where people do successfully stop, they will have nonetheless started to make a movement. So there will be muscle contraction happening, but they still don't press the button. And you can basically just look at the latency of that muscle contraction based on when the stop signal appeared and get a direct empirical measurement. So it's quite intuitive, really. You're looking at the time from when the stop signal appears to when the partial burst is what we call it, peaks. So hopefully that makes sense. Feel free to interrupt me if it doesn't. Okay, and another thing that I just want to describe before I talk about a particular study is motor selective stopping or response selective stopping. So this describes stopping one ongoing or planned movement while continuing with another. So this is something that we often have to do. So for example, if you're accelerating around a corner or something, or you're about to put your foot on the accelerator and then all of a sudden someone steps out onto the road, you still need to turn the wheel. There are still movements that you need to make to prevent a crash. You might have to avoid hitting another car or the curb or the person, but you need to cancel that movement with your foot where you were about to press the accelerator. And there's a lot of evidence now that this is performed kind of suboptimally. So when you stop this movement with your foot, there'll also be delays to any other ongoing actions. And the reason for this isn't fully understood. So that's just something else that we wanted to investigate here. And how do you instantiate this in a behavioral task? So this is an example of a motor selective stopping task. So the Go trials, similar to the ones I was describing before, still involve just responding to a stimulus, but in this instance, it's not a choice, it's a bimanual response. So you're pressing with both the left and right buttons. But then on a subset of trials, you have to stop just on one side. So you can see here that, so this is the stop signal here. It's appeared just on the right. Oh, can people see my mouse? By the way, I'm using it a lot to point to things. Yeah?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, so yes, in this instance, you would just respond with the left hand. So there still is a behavioral response that's made in this stop trial. Okay, so having explained that, I'll now talk about a particular study. So a question that I kind of had quite randomly, but something that occurred to me was that there's a lot of literature that kind of uses either an auditory or a visual stop without including that as a intended manipulation. And there are of course a handful of studies that directly compared stopping to auditory, between auditory and visual cues. But the findings from these were inconsistent. So generally, it looked like stopping to auditory cues was faster, and that kind of makes sense because like reaction times to auditory stimuli are usually faster, so it makes sense that the stopping process would also be faster in those instances. But there were some studies which found that, well, either the opposite or that there was no difference. And usually they didn't have a visual go cue. So they were manipulating. So the ones that did find faster stopping to auditory stimuli were manipulating the modality of the stop signal, but not the go signal. So they would still have visual goes when they had auditory stops. And it just seemed like a kind of interesting lead to investigate. So I wanted to look at that. And also there was no extant research, to my knowledge, looking at the stopping interference effect, which is that kind of suboptimal motor selective stopping. It's the delay to the ongoing action in response to auditory stimuli. So these were the experimental conditions that we had. So firstly, we've just got the purely visual task. So this is exactly as I described before. Then we had one that still had the visual stops, but also had auditory goes. So this was just a tone played in headphones. So it's just a sine wave played on both sides. And then we had two more versions with auditory stops. So this was still a motor selective stopping task. So we still had the auditory tone playing only on one side. So you would hear a tone of a different frequency, importantly, so you're not going to get it mixed up with a go cue, playing in either the left or the right headphone. And then this one is a purely auditory task. So you could technically do that with your eyes closed, but we asked people to keep them open because we wanted them to see feedback and everything. And then there was also just a third question that I had, which was that is there multisensory facilitation, of the stopping process? So there was this one paper that found that the opposite was true, that if you combined numerous sensory modalities for a stop signal, it actually impeded stopping, which is contrary to anything that's found with like simple reaction times. Normally, if you combine different modalities, people speed up. But the experiment that found this had quite unusual stimuli. So their visual stop was an image of a human face, and the sound was a human voice, which is fine. But yeah, we wanted to check whether the same thing would occur with basic stimuli. Was that a question or something? I thought I heard a voice briefly. Oh, okay, cool. Oh, I didn't mean to click on the screen there. But yeah, so we had this with visual goes and then audio visual stops. And I would have liked to have another condition where there were auditory goes and audio visual stops. So we would then have like a nice 3x2 design with 2 different modalities for go signal and 3 different modalities for the stop signal. But the experiment was way too long already. So that's a picture of my face when I realized that the best way to do it would just be to have the 5 conditions and then run a bunch of planned post-hoc tests, but treating condition as like the one variable rather than treating stop and go signal modality as separate variables. So I'll just summarize what we found. Overall, stopping to auditory signals was not faster. When you averaged across the different conditions with different go signal modalities. And this was confirmed with Bayesian analysis. So yeah, that was interesting. But more interestingly, we found that cross-modal tasks, so where you're going from like a visual go to an auditory stop or vice versa, did result in faster stopping than unimanual tasks. Unimodal. And we also found, of course, that there was facilitation of the stopping effect, of the stopping process, sorry, when a multimodal stop signal was used. So what are the implications of this? Well, the claim that stopping to auditory signals is faster isn't actually completely true. It depends on the modality of the preceding signal. So it was nice to be able to kind of like explain an inconsistency in the literature there. But also kind of a bit more broadly, it relates to that independence between the go and stop processes for calculation of SSRT, because it kind of indicates that like the processing of the stop signal is directly influenced by the processing of the go signal. So yeah, it's kind of raised a few questions in relation to that, and made me glad that we weren't just using SSRT here, that we were using cancel time. Cancel time is the measure that is derived from EMG, by the way. I don't think I actually named that before. Yeah, so that was cool. In terms of the reprogramming of movements, I mentioned that we also wanted to look at that motor selective stopping and whether it was influenced by auditory or visual cues. It was slower to auditory cues, but I think actually that may have just been a result of the task, because if you imagine like hearing a tone in one ear and then you have to stop on that side and press a button on the other, that's actually a little bit less intuitive than just seeing a stop signal, or at least it feels less intuitive when you're actually doing it. So yeah, I would want to confirm this with more research, structuring it in a slightly different way before concluding that, you know, action reprogramming to auditory cues is slower. Why did we find faster stopping in cross-modal tasks? I'm not really sure, because it's, you know, it was just muscle activity and behavioural responses, but it seems plausible to say that this could be attentional capacity restrictions. So kind of just separate attentional resources for visual and auditory stimuli, allowing for less resource sharing and resulting in faster cancellation to the stop signal. The other main kind of question here is, why is there multi-sensory facilitation of stopping? This is actually not that surprising. It's more surprising that other literature had found that the opposite was true. So we know that multisensory integration is distributed right throughout the sensory hierarchy, and it's well established that if you combine modalities for stimuli, then people will respond more quickly. So it makes sense that would generalize to the cancellation of a response. And yeah, this is in Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience if anyone is interested. So I'll talk about one other study as well. So this uses a lot of the same kind of paradigms and has a lot of the same questions, but we wanted to look at the role of attentional capture in action cancellation. So there have been a bunch of studies fairly recently that have found that as well as like the voluntary cancellation of movement that happens in a stop signal task, there is an involuntary moment of inhibition that occurs when you orient your attention to an unexpected stimuli. And of course, because stop signals are occurring on a subset of trials, it's fairly infrequent. This same involuntary inhibitory response is likely to be recruited. So how do you investigate this in a stop signal task? As in, like, how do you extract that attentional component of inhibition and look at it in isolation? Well, one purported way of doing that is to use stimulus selective stopping. And this is stopping in response to some stimuli, but not to others. So for instance, if you're walking along on a really hot day and you're kind of like in the bush and you're expecting there to be a snake because it just feels kind of snaky, and then you see a coiled up log or something and it looks vaguely like a snake, you may pause for a moment and think, that's a snake. Oh wait, no, it's not, it's a stick, and keep going. This example I've got here, actually, I realized isn't very good, because if you saw this stick hanging up in the tree, you probably wouldn't think, yeah, I'm going to walk into that. But nonetheless, the point hopefully is clear. In terms of instantiating this in a task, you've still got your go trials on the majority of the task, so that's not pictured here. And then you've got your stop trials with one type of stimulus and your ignore trials with a different type. Here we used different colors of circle, but there are lots of different ways that you could do this. Something you might have been thinking there is that, well, actually, this isn't just the attentional component, because there's also the time required for stimulus discrimination. So you might notice that there's something that you need to pay attention to, and that will cause you to pause, that'll slow you down, but then there'll be some latency required for determining whether or not this is a snake or a stick, or whether or not it is purple or blue. So you're going to notice the change, you're going to notice the stimulus before you identify the qualities of the stimulus and make a decision based on that. So this isn't really extracting the attentional component, it's extracting the attentional component and the discriminatory component. So we had another task here in this other experiment that I'm going to describe called an unexpected go task. And this had no stopping in it at all. So the go stimulus was a choice reaction time task. So here you're responding on the side of the yellow circle. And then on a subset of trials, the same proportion as was used in the stop signal tasks, the blue circle, which indicated don't respond on this side, would change colors to yellow, and a movement would need to be made on that side as well. Importantly, people were told that they didn't have to make their responses synchronous, so there was absolutely no reason to like slow down responses here at all. So and they were also told to make their responses as quickly as possible. So there's no motivation for any inhibition. So any inhibition that occurs can, for all extents and purposes, be treated as involuntary. So yeah, just to summarize, these were the 4 conditions that we had. So we've got the motor selective stop signal task, the combined motor and stimulus selective stop signal task, We've got the unexpected go task and another version of that that also featured ignore cues. And in this instance, you would press just on the one side still. So these are EMG profiles. It's combined data from all of the participants. So on the x-axis here, you've got time, and then on the y-axis, you've got amplitude. Up the top, we've got the go trials, and you can see that people are pressing the buttons. Underneath that, we've got the stop trials, and we've partitioned out here trials that did demonstrate the partial bursts from those that didn't. So the blue ones are the ones with partial bursts, and you can see that very clearly there. So people are initiating a movement and then inhibiting it, and then because this was a motor selective task, they're then making a unimanual response on this side. And you can actually see the same thing with the, sorry, something popped up, with the ignore cues. And it looks very similar. The actual shape of that partial burst is very much the same. So you can see people are kind of stopping in the same way, albeit less frequently. And this is from the unexpected go task. So the shaded areas represent kind of confidence intervals here. So you can see that it's still happening and it's still a very similar shape that people are kind of demonstrating this inhibition. It just didn't happen as frequently. And of course, there were behavioural delays associated with these partial bursts as well. So people were inhibiting their movements when they saw that additional stimuli, despite task instructions not to, and then enacting another movement. So what does this mean? Yeah, it supports the idea that stop signal tasks result in a combined measure of two dissociable processes, one of which occurs commonly outside of stopping contexts. Also, we found that this delay, the attentional orienting contribution to the stopping interference effect, is larger than previously considered. And this is in psychophysiology, if you want to look at that more. Yeah, okay. So this obviously isn't, well, hopefully I made it obvious, but this isn't the first paper to have identified that there's involuntary inhibition in response to attentional orienting. So there's this model that was initially a rodent model, but it has now been kind of generalized to humans, that is called the pause then cancel model. And this attempts to tease apart these two processes. So it claims that there's kind of a pause process that kind of pauses motor output and buys time for a voluntary cancel process. So this is essentially the two, or it may be the two things that the two dissociable processes that I was just discussing. So I basically just wanted to ask a series of follow-up questions on that study to assess whether or not those partial bursts represent a pause process. So the kind of seminal paper that attempts to bring this pause and cancel model to humans predicts that the pause process would be observable at the level of the muscle, and that partial bursts would be an example of that. So yeah, I just wanted to question whether or not this is what we're seeing here. Something that I didn't do in the initial publication, surprisingly, is check that the latency of this pause was the same in all the different conditions. So this is what I've done here. It was. So that same kind of partial burst offset following the stop signal or additional go signal or ignore signal was occurring at the same latency across all the tasks. Something I didn't mention is that we also looked at effects of age, but I decided not to discuss that here. But that's why there's an O and a Y here. That's the older cohort and the younger cohort. Another assumption of this model is that the pause process should occur non-selectively. So it should occur in all muscles that currently have tonic activity going on, I suppose. So in a number of trials, you can imagine that we had partial bursts on both sides rather than just on one. So I isolated those trials and checked whether the pause was happening synchronously. It was. In most of the trials, there were a few where it wasn't quite, but I was happy with this. So this is a figure of the distribution of the differences between the latency of the partial burst in the left and right hands. And you can see that it's mostly around 0, indicating that there was no difference. Another key distinction between purported pause and cancel is that the pause is not diagnostic of stopping success based on the definitions that are suggested in this model. But this isn't really what we see. So what we were looking at with these partial bursts pretty much was diagnostic of stopping success. It's not as though people were kind of slowing their movement, or it wasn't as though like the muscle activity stopped a little bit and then fully stopped. It just kind of has a downturn. It, for all extents and purposes, it very much is the cancellation of the action at the level of the muscle. So that was just a bit interesting in terms of like how these two things are defined, and it made me think, well, actually, maybe this isn't a pause process, and it leaves us with two options. Either the pause and cancel process must reach the level of the muscle simultaneously, resulting in a single inhibitory signature, which probably isn't right, because the pause process is meant to be faster than the cancel process. It's meant to buy time for it. Or the pause process needs to be redefined such that it's sufficient for stopping, raising questions about the role of the cancel process. So this is just something I've been thinking about that may be interesting. Hopefully it is. So in summary, just to wrap up this series of things that I've talked about, there's clearly some inhibitory effect associated with attentional capture, and this can be observed at the level of the muscle. But the best theoretical interpretation of this remains unclear, at least to me. The manifestation of these inhibitory processes at the level of the muscle is dependent on a range of methodological decisions. So I just talked about one of those with the study we looked at where we were comparing auditory and visual stops. We also looked at a couple of other things, but yeah, the stopping process depends a lot on context, which raises questions about how these tasks should be designed in order to generalize to the real world. And that final point is the same one that I just made. So yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about in terms of me talking in a linear direction. So we can ask questions now, or you can ask questions, but thank you for your time and or attention, and also thanks to these people that I've been working with. Are you all still there? Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'll stop sharing my screen. Hold on. Cool. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask.
Evan has his hand up.
I do. I don't know if you want me to just jump in. Thanks, Simon. That was really interesting work. And the last study that you presented is actually quite similar to something that we've been thinking about in our lab as well. Those designs, I'm thinking of, there's one the Jan Vessel's lab has where they show suppression of corticospinal excitability when an ignore stimulus is shown. One thing we've always been concerned about with those designs is that the ignore stimulus and the stop signal are very similar. And we wondered whether basically what you see to the ignore stimulus is basically just some unresolved confusion about, perceptual confusion about which stimulus is actually being shown. Yeah. So there's a period in which you can't, there is limited discrimination between the two signals. And during that time, what you're seeing is effectively the beginning of a stop process, suppression related to that, rather than some sort of automatic attention orienting response.
Yeah.
And well, the analysis you just showed seems to be entirely consistent with that idea. Would you agree? Or
yeah, I would agree in that, like, we saw that pause, if that's the correct term for it, well, way more frequently in response to the ignore cues than we did to the unexpected go cues, if that makes sense. So to me, that suggests that there's more of a recruitment of stopping in response to ignore cues, and it's not just the attentional component. Like, there's obviously something in those trials on above and beyond just attentional orienting that's influencing stopping. And yeah, it's probably stimulus discrimination, as you were describing. But it could also be like context, in that people weren't expecting to stop in our unexpected go trials as well. So there's that too. There's the expectation, as well as the stimulus discrimination that could have an effect. But yeah,
as part of the task set or something, they're not expecting to have to stop.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. James, I can see hands waving.
Yeah. Hi there. Can you go to slide 22? I think it was the one with the first burst and then the pause and then. What was that?
Oh, it's down the bottom left. I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just let me reshare my screen.
I thought that was the easiest way to get to the right place.
Okay, 22. Yep.
That's next one. Oh no, yeah, that one will do. Well, both of them really. When I look at the uni manual go.
Oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that.
When I look at the uni manual go, just before 0, I see a little increase and decrease in the trace, which mimics somewhat what you see in the success with partial, just perhaps a little more subtle. Have you?
Oh, you mean in the green ones?
Even in the even in the black trace at the top, the uni manual.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, there's this little dip. Got any ideas about why that's there and how that might then relate to what you see in the other conditions where there is some stopping?
I mean, that's interesting. It's worth saying here that these are all synchronized to the EMG onset of the response generating burst. So I haven't actually looked at this little divot here in great detail, but it would be worth checking to see that that's still there with a different synchronization reference, right? Because this is group data. But yeah, it's certainly not something that I really looked at, to be honest. Yeah, did you have a particular thought in mind when you mentioned it, or was it just a?
Well, I'm just trying to get my head around it. I mean, nothing in particular. Just is there some form of sequential thing that's a series of processes that's even happening, even when you just try and do a timed go with no possibility of stopping.
Yeah. I mean, it also happens. So this was the slide I've just jumped to is a bimanual task, and you can still see it there. So because part of me was thinking, oh, maybe then when you said that, I thought maybe it's to do with like the stimulus appearing and the participant kind of pausing to figure out which side they need to respond on. But it is also happening in the bimanual task. Who knows? Maybe I'm just speculating wildly here, but maybe even the go stimulus elicits some kind of attentional orienting pause, and this results in muscle suppression, and that's what we're seeing here. That's possible.
Can I jump in and offer a very boring explanation?
Please.
So usually, at least the wrist device, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the wrist device we have. So you can measure forces in any direction pretty much. But if you ask people to do a wrist flexion, what happens is sometimes they're going to do wrist extension and then flexion. And I think sometimes even with these tiny movements, you can do the same things, kind of a preparation for action you do in advance. Okay, cool. I could be completely wrong, but I have seen in the wrist quite a few times. And yeah, usually we instruct people try to avoid that. Okay. Someone's just written something in the chat as well. Increase in interhemispheric inhibition immediately preceding EMG onset in reaction time. That could also be it, I guess. Oh no, but
also not just interhemispheric inhibition. There's these preparatory inhibition effects that you can see even just in the same hemisphere.
Yeah, with TMS, but I guess, is that normally observed?
I guess I just observed the exact same pattern, and I'm trying to get my head around, well, there really is no need to put a pause mechanism into it when on a Go trial.
No, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, yeah, I guess I mentioned that because, so yeah, those other explanations I mean, I don't know, I haven't looked into that, but it sounds pretty convincing to me. But that model, though, that theoretical model does suggest that this pause would be pretty ubiquitous, that it would also happen to the Go stimulus. So, but, you know, if there's another explanation that's just happening as a result of like muscle contractions, I'm happy with that. Did anyone else have questions? Oh, I'm still showing my screen. Sorry. Let me.
Just thinking about the first part of your talk, Simon, do you think if there is some credence to the idea of a pause process, do you think that might help explain why cross-modality stop signal reaction time is faster? I could be wrong about this, but I think the pause then cancel model sort of assumes that unexpected stimuli are particularly salient and might generate a larger sort of attention orienting response, stronger pause response.
And you're saying that it would be less expected because it's in a different modality to the Go? Is that?
Well, I guess you kind of have to squint and look sideways to believe that, but you know, in the sense that there is sort of prediction error in our sensory systems, predictive coding in our sensory systems, then something is coming through the other modality less frequently, then in some ways it's less predicted on a trial to trial basis.
Yeah, definitely. Like I hadn't thought of that, but it's definitely plausible thinking about it like theoretically. I don't know how you'd test that, but yeah,
sure. Yeah,
it seems like a possible explanation. I was really grasping at straws to explain that when we initially found it. So yeah, if anyone else has any ideas on that, that'd be great. Any other questions?
Really, really interesting talk, Simon.
Thank you.
I guess my question is, so you've presented the results there only for cancel time, right?
Yes.
Did you also look at the behavioral SSRTs?
Yeah, we did. So we found basically the same things in terms of the auditory and visual stops. It was the same for, the only difference was that there was less strong evidence for the null in the Bayesian follow-up analysis, looking at the lack of difference between auditory and visual stops. But yeah, it very much reflected the cancel time. I did do correlations as well, because I thought when I was writing it up, it's nice to use a more conventional measure. So I did some correlations of like mean cancel time with SSRT, and they were pretty well correlated in all of the conditions. I didn't include those in the slides, unfortunately, but I can check. I think it's kind of like moderate correlations for all of them. Yeah. So yeah, still definitely used SSRT. And I should also mention that like I kind of whinged about SSRT a bit there, but there are, as you're probably aware, like other means of calculating that deal with those violations. It's just that hasn't been generalized to selective stopping tasks, so we still wanted to not use those.
Thanks.
No worries. Cool. Well, any other questions or?
Sorry, not Leanne Welber here. Sorry.
Oh, hi.
Simon, I was wondering, look, when you go audio-visual, in the beginning, it's going to be kind of more complex because you have kind of divide attention. So did you look at the effect of experience? So divide first block, second block. So if people are getting better after they have some exposure to this more complex, if you like, type of condition?
Arguably, I wouldn't. Yeah, I maybe wouldn't think of it as more complex, or at least if it was more complex, that didn't impact performance in the way that I'd expect, in that like stopping was faster in the combined stimulus condition. I didn't look at effects over time, or at least not that I remember. So if I did, I guess there wasn't anything there. But yeah, it would be worth checking, because I guess people seem to grasp and to understand the tasks pretty quickly. Like at the end of the day, they were pretty straightforwards, but
yeah, I'm pretty certain people can understand and do the tasks. Humans are pretty good at that, but becoming automatic is a slightly different thing.
Yeah, I didn't look at it as far as I remember.
Yeah.
So yeah, be worth checking out.
The other question I had is, like, did you think of trying to match the intensity of auditory and visual stimuli as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of apples and oranges to an extent. So I think this is a common problem in research comparing sensory modalities. So we basically just made sure that, like, because you've got so many things, right? You've got the frequency of the sound, you've got the volume of the sound, and then you can try and match those onto visual components. You know, does volume equate to size, or it gets a bit tricky. So we just made sure that the stimuli were easily discernible by the participants and stuff like that. But I understand now, after having gone through a review, that there are processes for actually trying to equate those a bit more. So yeah, I think, yeah, it'd be, I did think about it beforehand, and then I thought about it a lot more afterwards. Was there anything else on that? Did I answer your question there, or?
No, that's
okay,
perfectly
cool.
fine.
Yeah.
Simon, thanks for your talk. I might jump in and ask a question if that's okay. And I do apologise, I had to miss some parts. I had to urgently respond
That's all right.
to a few things, but kind of related to one of the recent questions there. I think in one of the outcomes you showed a difference between young and older individuals early on. So again, along this motor learning kind of aspect, do you think that this is a trainable quality if you think over longer periods of time? Like in older adults, is there potential to make this better?
It seems pretty inherent in terms of, like, generally people don't improve in their stopping times. It's kind of like fairly consistent irrespective of practice. Maybe don't quote me on that, but I think that if there are papers out there that observe improvement in stopping speed, it would be very small.
Yeah.
In terms of like the age stuff that you've touched on there, we kind of just found, the same things that have been found in the literature beforehand. So older people were slower at stopping. This is peripheral to your question, but we did also find that that attentional orienting response and the involuntary inhibition associated with that occurred over a longer time window for older adults. So they were kind of like more susceptible to stopping interference effects as a result of attentional orienting. But yeah, to answer your question, I don't think people really improve at that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I don't know myself, so I'm just curious to see what you think. Yeah.
Any other questions?
No, I don't think we have any other questions. But yeah, please feel free to reach out to Simon on email if you have further questions. Thank you so much for presenting this great talk today, and thank you everyone for hopping in and engaging. It was really good. Yeah, and if you have any suggestions for anyone, any early career people you'd like to dob in to present in this series, to really showcase their excellent work, please let me know. We have spots for July, August, October at this stage. But yeah. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Leanne. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
organising.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Simon.
See you
Thanks,
later.
Leanne.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
See you.
Thanks. Bye.
Did you stop recording? Still recording.
Mark is still there.
Oh, Mark.
Um,
Hey, Mark.
yeah. They popped up. I'll stop recording.
Mark is the only one who couldn't hear anything.
So
He couldn't read
I'm just
the,
slow.
couldn't-
I'm just
he's
slow.
there. He's there. He's there. Just as you
Thanks,
said
Leanne.
something
Thanks,
mean
Robert.
about.
Hey, Mark.
You stop recording? No.
Yeah, I'll stop recording. Sorry.
Ah, yes.
Um,